Good evening, everyone. Thank you for your patience. My name is Ara Araz, and thank you for joining this evening's conversation with political analyst Lilit Kevorkian and former diplomat Armen Kharazian. Thank you, Lilit and Armen, for accepting the invitation. It's the first of the What's Next series of discussions on the post-war Armenian reality. Special thanks are owed to our sponsors. They are the Ararat Eskidja Museum, the Armenian Bar Association, the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party, or Ramgavars, Armenian Network of America, Daughters of Vartan, Sahaganush Otyag, Justice Armenia, Knights of Vartan, Bakraduni Lodge, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR, and the Kalus Gulbenkian Foundation Lecture Series on Contemporary Armenian Issues, and St. Leon Armenian Church. The purpose of this evening's discussion is to widen our understanding of how we got here, what is happening, and what is at stake. To this end, Lili will examine events since 2016, while Armen will provide additional background and frame the discussion within the context of Armenia's state-building experience. Together, and with the help of our audience, you, they will also look at the need for new approaches. Lilit Kevorkian is Russia and CIS Associate Director, where she's responsible for analyzing the macroeconomic, political, security, and business environment of Russia and former Soviet republics. She's a frequent contributor to major media outlets, and earlier in her career, she worked for the Ministries of Foreign Affairs and Economy in Armenia. Armen Kharazian is principal attorney of Washington, D.C.-based Kharazian Law, where he represents clients in white-collar criminal defense and investigations pertaining to, among other matters, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and anti-money laundering statutes, export control and sanctions, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and the Lobby Disclosure Act. Armen is a former member of Armenia's Foreign Service, where he held senior positions as Deputy Chief of Mission in Washington, D.C., and head of the Foreign Ministry's Arms Control and International Security Affairs Department. His prior postings include Armenia's missions to the OSCE, IAEA, and the CFE Treaty Joint Consultative Group in Vienna, and Armenia's delegation to the Nagorno-Karabakh peace talks. Among other agreements, Armen negotiated Armenia's first individual partnership program with NATO, in addition to other matters concerning military technical cooperation, counterproliferation, regulation and compliance, and regional security. Thank you once again, Lilit Armen, for being with us. Everyone, please know that questions may be submitted using the Q&A feature. And if Lilit, you're now ready, we can begin.
Thank you, Ara. Thank you for this opportunity, and I'm really happy to share the panel with Armen Kharazian. Certainly look forward to his contribution. In the next half an hour or so, I will focus on the events that led to the last year's catastrophic war, and I will expand on what is the most likely scenario of development if the Armenian government, its key opposition forces, and the diaspora continue their current strategies. I thought to start this presentation by quoting the Russian First Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin. So on the 11th of April 2016, he gave an interview to a Russian top radio station, Echo Moskvy, days after the main military operations had stopped along the line of contact in Artsakh. So this is right after the 4-day war in 2016 in April. But when he was talking to the radio station, the shootings, incursions continued. So he was asked about his recent 2 trips to the capital of Azerbaijan within a space of months, where he declared that arms sales to Baku will continue regardless the 4-day war. And the journalist asked him whether it's correct to say that Russia militarily supports both Azerbaijan and Armenia. So Mr. Rogozin replied, so you understand that Armenia is our ally through the CSTO, which is the Russian-led military organization, sort of the Russian equivalent of NATO. He added, but Azerbaijan is our strategic partner in the region. We're connected with Azerbaijan by many economic ties. There's a large Azeri diaspora in Russia, and they pay for Russian weapons. It is not the weapons that shoot, he said, it's people who shoot. He also added, I want to say there has been a lot of horrible demagogy and a lot of verbal diarrhea right after my Baku visit, is the end of quote. The journalist then went on to suggest that perhaps Armenians are concerned about the arms transfers to Azerbaijan, to which he answered that war requires cold-heartedness and not whimpering and propaganda. Now, I brought this quote because I thought that this episode, as unpleasant as it was, encapsulated the deterioration of Armenian-Russian relations. We're talking about 2016 now. The commentary came against the backdrop of our worst developments, signaling that Armenia's near total isolation at the outbreak of the 2016 war. Ragozin's statements also came after conspicuous silence from Moscow when the war broke out on the 1st of April. And also the war was followed by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's proposition that perhaps Azerbaijan should consider joining the Russian-led security bloc to facilitate the Karabakh conflict resolution. It also happened at a time, this commentary came at a time when Armenia's key partners through the Eurasian Union canceled their meeting in Yerevan, basically not to upset Azerbaijan, whilst the Russian Premier Medvedev traveled to Baku on the 7th of April together with Deputy Prime Minister Rogozin, where they stated that arms sales to Baku will continue. This is happening 3 years after Armenia abandoned its association agreement talks with the European Union and joined the Russian-led customs union. This is happening after Armenia extended the lease for the Russian military base until 2044. It agreed to take full costs of this military base, unlike, for example, Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan that also host Russian bases. It's happening after Armenia handed over 100% control of its energy company, gas company, agreed to import hydrocarbon exports exclusively from Russia until 2043. And it handed over the portion of Armenia-Iran gas pipeline to Russian supermajor Gazprom. So by April 2016, Armenia had found itself in diplomatic isolation, but that isolation has been in making since really times of Levon Petrosyan, who probably is de facto architect of Armenia's Russia-centered security strategy. And here I hope that Armen will expand more on the origins of this architecture, how it evolved, and perhaps on some of the failed attempts to diversify Armenia's foreign policy. But what is the essence of this architecture? And the narrative of this strategy is something quite straightforward, and one can easily hear from any Armenian. You can ask any diaspora Armenian, and they'd say that, look, Armenia is weak. It's surrounded by hostile Turks and Azeris. It doesn't have any energy resources, and Russia is its traditional Christian ally. So there are no other options but to tag along. Now, the problem with this narrative is that, apart from some factual mistakes, it offers no alternative. It supposes that there is a permanent overlap of Russian and Armenian national interest, which is a fallacy, to put it mildly. Nonetheless, neither any Armenian government nor the politically active diaspora organizations left their comfort zone for decades or considered any alternative scenarios, I would argue. This security system effectively started collapsing on the 1st of April when Azeri forces launched an attack along the entire line of contact in Artsakh. This led to human losses as well as the loss of some strategic heights in Artsakh. Arguably, this was a reconnaissance war, to quote the Armenian General Kaditer Tadevosyan, and it was also a prelude for the full-scale war, which took place, as we saw, in April-November last year. However, this war became possible due to geopolitical shifts in the region in prior years. And it was mainly because of the disturbance of the balance of military capabilities between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The process in full, this process it started sort of in full nearly a decade ago. And it's worth probably highlighting that Artsakh conflict was the only conflict where Soviets were vehemently opposed to. And this is the only conflict where there was no Russian presence, military presence until 2020. And it was also unique in the sense that it rested, the truce rested on the military balance of power between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's worth also mentioning that in 1990s, members of OSCE, under auspices of which the peace talks have been happening, they agreed on the embargo of large-scale arms sales to the parties to a conflict to prevent the outbreak of new war. However, this balance started shifting after Azerbaijan sealed a large arms deal with Russia. It was worth around $5 billion. And it launched the reform of its army in 2010. By the time of 2016 war, Russian arms sales accounted for 85% of total Azeri arms imports. And it's also interesting that Armenia had arranged for delivery of new weapon systems in 2015 using about 200 million US dollar credit that they took from Russia, but these weapons never arrived. Well, they actually arrived, but after the 2016 war, when Armenia agreed sort of reluctantly to join Russian air defense, the consequences of which we saw during the 2020 war. I was wondering if I could share some slides here, because probably the visuals will give a better explanation. I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yes, Lily, we can.
Okay, so just to show you the comments I was making about the arms transfers. In terms of total arms transfers, this is CPRI data. Russia accounts for 60% of all Azeri arm imports and 93% of total Armenian arms imports. Now, it's worth breaking this down, and this is what I wanted to show. On the left-hand side, you can see the Armenian arms purchases. Again, it's the same source, CPRI. And you can see that it's quite patchy. Whereas with the Azeri imports, you can see that there is a very clear trend. There's a significant pickup starting from 2010. And this is the main window of Russian transfers. So between 2009, when the contracts were drawn up, and really major last deliveries happening in 2017. In absolute terms, you can see that the most of these arms purchases for Russia, for the Azeri army, came from Russia. Later on, you see, I'll jump back here, you see that there are other countries that join as major suppliers to Azerbaijan, Israel being one of them, And of course, another nominal Russia ally, Belarus, is an arms supplier. But I want to highlight that, for example, Turkish arms sales remains relatively small. And these are some graphs that I found quite useful. Just shows that so by 2019, this is the shift in balance of military capabilities is quite obvious. The blues represent the Azeri capabilities and orange Armenian. Now, one thing that I really wanted to emphasize here is that you can see that in terms of the shift in balance, you're talking about in categories where the transfers from Russia and from Belarus made a big difference, and partially Israel, but really this the first two. So you see that the total artillery, rocket artillery, self-propelling and so forth, tanks and armored vehicles, Air Force, have to highlight that, of course. Fighter aircraft, you can see that complete dominance in many categories. So let me just jump back, or I can leave it here for you to have a look. So apart from so apart from these military arms transfers, there were several events, several milestones that led to Russian Azeri strategic cooperation. And I would say that.
Excuse me, Lily.
Yep.
Hey, Lily. There's a little bit of a rustling sound or some other sound going on in the background. It started when you started showing the slides. I don't know if it's related to the slides, but it's kind of coincided with that.
Okay, is this?
Maybe it's the moving of a mouse, maybe moving of your mouse on your computer. I don't know, but there's like a little bit of a rustling. Armin, do you hear it also or no?
I do.
Yeah.
Just
okay.
a little bit.
Right.
It doesn't. I can still hear what she says.
Yeah, but there's a little bit
enough.
some interference though. If you
Okay.
can detect, if you can identify it and and remedy it, that would be great. If you can't, we'll just it's okay also, like Armin said. But if you could, remedy it, it would be great.
I wonder if it's the fan of the computer.
Oh.
It could be could be permanent. I'm afraid.
It's okay.
I don't see any other source.
Like right now, I don't hear
sorry.
Right now, I don't hear it, for example.
Okay, that's good. Maybe it will. Maybe you'll get used to it.
Yeah. Now I heard it. Maybe I wonder if it's the wire from your earphone. I wonder if is that rubbing against something? Is that rubbing against your sweater? Maybe could that be it?
Not really. Is this okay?
Maybe. Well, speak and I'll let you know.
Is this okay?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
But let's go. Let's continue.
All right.
Sorry.
I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
So I just wanted to mention some of the milestones that happened in Russian Azeri strategic cooperation, and the key development regionally was the 2008 Georgian War, and it was very clear that these frozen conflicts were becoming activated, and this is a time when Russia is reviving the idea of customs union and Eurasian economic union. This was sort of seen as Russia's answer to European Union expansion. And as Georgia was drifting away from Russia, it was very important for Moscow to make sure that Armenia stays under control and possibly start bringing back other former Soviet states into this economic integration project. Of course, it has to be said that Armenia was already sort of reorienting itself towards Russia, and this has happened, at least economically, under Robert Kocharyan. Now, I wonder if I can show you a few more slides without causing more trouble, but let's try it and hopefully it will work. I just want to show you this. This is the Armenia's export destination. Data is from 2002. And it just shows the Armenia's key external trade partners. I don't know if many knew, but Belgium, for example, was the top trading partner, followed by United Kingdom. Israel was another one, and Russia accounted only for 11% of Armenian exports. Now, fast forward to 2019, and the picture has changed dramatically. As you can see, and Russia is the dominant destination. I included here the Azeri export destinations 2002. Italy is, which is basically the gas exports, is the dominant destination. Here you can see that Russia is only 3%, imports 3% of Azeri export. And in 2019, the picture hasn't really changed that much, except that Turkey has become quite more prominent, more pronounced partner. Russian share remains more or less the same. So I just wanted to give you the visuals to explain where Armenia was and how it was moving. But the basis of this shift and the increase of Russian economic influence in Armenia happened through two major events, and this is known as assets for debt exchange. So Armenia, and in fact, the idea came from Vladimir Putin when he was visiting Armenia back in 2000. The idea was that Armenia will hand over some of its assets to Russia for a meager $90 million debt. Prior to that, Armenia was paying around $16 million per annum as interest interest service or interest payment, which was quite high, to be honest. So in 2002, Armenia hands over Hrazdan thermal power plant, which was Armenia's largest, along with several research and production enterprises, which were part of the Soviet military industrial plans. And later on, Armenia also hands over in 2006 Hrazdan 5 block. Now, just to explain the importance of these assets, Hrazdan 5 block was it was a large investment project that was carried out by Iran's Sanir company. Armenia got 150 million soft loan from Iran, and the idea was that Armenia will import Iranian gas. It will be used to produce electricity. This electricity will cover 40% of Armenia's electricity requirements, and then Armenia will be supplying the remainder to Iran to cover for the loan, and then ultimately the plant would generate around $100 million per annum for Armenian profit. It's just one example of sort of the economic losses that Armenia incurred through this deal. And to give a bigger context to this, just to give a couple of other numbers, Russia, in fact, forgave about $242 million of debt to Tajikistan, about $500 million to Kyrgyzstan, $32 billion for Cuba, $19 billion for African countries, in total about $100 billion in recent decade. But coming back to their arms sales, as I showed you, you can see that how patchy Armenia's arms acquisitions were, whereas our Azeri purchases are really coinciding with those geopolitical changes and shifts in the region. There is a a line of argument that supposedly these transfers weren't that significant for Azeri army, but when you see the breakdown of it, you know, the number of tanks and Smerch and toss multiple rocket launchers, the fighter jets, fighter bombers, and so forth, it shows that effectively the core of the army, Azeri army capability, is produced in Russia. Now, these changes are happening along with the emergence of the so-called Lavrov Plan during the Artsakh talks. By 2010, as the customs union was launching, Russia was actively promoting its expansion. As I mentioned, you know, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Central Asian countries were approached and offered membership, as well as Azerbaijan. However, from the Azeri side, one of the lines of argument was that Azerbaijan needs to restore its territorial integrity before considering joining any blocs promoted by Russia. So in a nutshell, this Lavrov plan, or more precisely Putin plan, would see Azerbaijan taking control of regions around Artsakh, first 5 regions and then 2, Lachin and Kilbajar. And then most importantly, the status of the region will not be determined, or as Armenian third president Sarkisian revealed recently in his interview, any vote by Artsakh would have happened within the Azeri constitution, meaning the issue of independence was out of question. Now, what Russia was gaining in this setup was the deployment of its peacekeeping forces in the region, because this was contrary to prior arrangements within the Minsk group that the regional states and co-chairs would not have their troops in the peacekeeping forces. So it was quite good proposal, win-win proposal for both Russia and Azerbaijan, one would argue, but clearly at the expense of Armenia. There were other sort of developments happening that showed that Azerbaijan was also recalibrating its policy towards Russia. So in 2000, Azerbaijan was touting itself as a country that was opposing Russia, that was offering an alternative to Russian oil and gas supplies to Europe. Azerbaijan, in fact, kicked out Russian military contingents from its Gabala radar station in 2012. And by the way, this is happening while Russia is supplying weapons. It has already started supplying weapons to Azerbaijan, and the way it was done, the Azeri authorities increased the rent for the station from $7 million per annum to $300 million per annum. So it was basically an impossible offer, and obviously Russians didn't accept it and they left. But it appears that the Russian military industry was really keen on delivery of these arms to Azerbaijan. But what we're seeing by 2013, Azerbaijan is also sort of reviewing and recalibrating its energy export ambitions. By then, it has already shelved off the more ambitious and European Union-backed Nabucco energy pipeline project, which would ultimately see the Central Asian energy flowing through Azerbaijan and bypassing Russia and going to Europe. Instead, Azerbaijan opted for a much smaller southern corridor, and it would just focus on exports of its own hydrocarbons. At the same time, Azerbaijan also built a pipeline with Russia. The Azeri energy infrastructure was also exporting Russian crude oil. So we can see that in terms of their energy relations, the two countries were also seeing a lot of cooperation and integration. So by 2016, as Armenia had already joined the customs union, pretty much had lost most of its leverage. It had very little influence over the bargaining that was happening between Moscow and Baku over the future of Nagorno-Karabakh. But what's also noteworthy is that after the April 2016 war, under the German chairmanship of the OSCE, the Minsk Group proposes an installation of security measures along the line of contact to prevent an outbreak of a new war. But problem for Azerbaijan was that this would write off the possibility of military solution of the conflict, something that was not in Azeri plans. And luckily for President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, Russian president managed to thwart this idea of security mechanism. As it happened, Russia organized a trilateral meeting between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia in St. Petersburg in summer 2016, where again, these security measures were shelved off. Now, after the war of 2016, what we're seeing is increased pressure on Armenia to deliver on the return of these regions. But also Armenia was in quite isolated and weak state. Armenia was forced to hand over basically its air defense to Russia in October 2016. And because of the war, because of the outcome of the war, Armenia enters a period of political instability when the uprising of Sasnatzer happens, and the uprising directly and openly targets and talks about Russian Azeri plans regarding Artsakh. What was more important about this war and the subsequent political instability in Armenia was the breakup of the social contract in Armenia that probably took place starting from 1990s. In a nutshell, it was an agreement between Armenian elite or oligarchy and citizens, whereby Armenian citizens would tolerate, lack of freedoms, lack of economic opportunities, poor living standards, even the geopolitical choices, as long as the oligarchy guaranteed Armenia's and Artsakh security. It was clear that Ser Sarkisyan was seen as someone who lost the war, but what was more important, he was seen as someone who came up with who had this security architecture, Russia-based security architecture, which has stopped working both for Artsakh and Armenia. Arguably, April war was not a clear-cut victory for Azerbaijan, and some Russian experts and also government sources in Armenia had alleged that Armenia was deterred by Russia to stage a counterattack, as it would have led to potential Azeri losses, a potential political upheaval in Azerbaijan that could have jeopardized Russia's valued strategic partner Aliyev's position. But on the other hand, Ser Sarkisyan stepping down was not a big loss for Russia. After all, Sarkisyan had openly suggested in his interview right after the war, the interview that he gave to Bloomberg, that there were forces that wanted to bring peacekeepers to Artsakh. So he was alluding to Russian plan. Sarkisyan went to see Merkel immediately after the ceasefire, where he declared that that Armenia was left alone in this war, that Armenia was fighting with weapons from 1970s. So, in a nutshell, we're seeing that with the 2016 war, the security structure is crumbling. There's a looming war, and it was and this threat, this risk of looming war, lifts that straitjacket from ordinary Armenians. The status quo around Artsakh is collapsing, and the status quo in the Armenian domestic politics is also collapsing. But so by and large, neither Sarkisyan nor really Armenian political elite had a solution to Armenia's single most important issue, the physical security of the country and Artsakh Armenians. So I think that was one of the reasons why the revolution happened, and there was a successful revolutionary change of government in April 2018. People wanted change. They associated the change with the chance to achieve two things: to break down the corrupt oligarchy that had failed to equip the country with adequate capabilities and led to impoverishment of the country. And secondly, some saw in this revolution an opportunity to balance relations with Russia and perhaps to push back on this Lavrov plan. Revolution was a great chance for Armenia to use all its possible resources to deal with Armenia's national security crisis, because that's what it was. It was a national security crisis that started in 2016. It was a chance to engage with the US and France more widely and have a more meaningful agenda. And also it was a chance to buy time to make more better war contingency plans, to incorporate the latest knowledge of warfare seen in Syria and Libya. This includes, of course, the use of drones and so forth. It was a chance of more sophisticated foreign policy. But instead, what we saw, the Armenian political class effectively descended into infowars and military-grade disinformation campaign, where national security issues were used as, next convenient trick to discredit their opponents. So I think one of the most damaging tactics was this so-called Soros conspiracy, that accusing this revolutionary government to be basically sponsored by Soros or serving Western interests, whereas what we saw with Nikol Pashinyan government is effectively no change in foreign policy. The Russia-based security structure remained intact. The actions of the failures of Pashinyan and his team were very costly. There was a small window of opportunity that could have set Armenia on a different course and perhaps prevent or mitigate the scale of the war, but that has not been done. Pashinyan turned the revolution into simple regime change. He chose tribalism and loyalty over competence. He was quite sensitive to Russian sensitivities, because Russia effectively signaled that it wasn't very happy with full breakup of the oligarchy and prosecution of former corrupt officials and overhaul of the national security bloc. So there were minimum changes made in this regard. And moreover, it was this government that decided to send its military to Syria, something that even the previous government resisted. All again done in the same logic of, we are a strategic partners with Russia. We have to make sure that this relationship work, because that's the only option they had on the table. So we probably need an entire session to go and fully examine the failures of the Armenian government during the war. But I would just say that this 44-day war in 2020 accelerated political processes in Armenia. And what we're seeing now is a new reality where the Republic of Armenia's sovereignty and territorial integrity are under clear threat, and the future of Artsakh is bleak. What I want to highlight is that the 9th of November 2020 three-party declaration effectively shows that the Russian plan, or Lavrov plan, has been more or less fully implemented. But the declaration also has a quite dangerous element in it, which wasn't in the original plan, I would argue, and that's the 9th clause, which links the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia's Sunik region and effectively compromises Armenia's territorial integrity. It effectively says that an unspecified corridor will be controlled by a foreign force, by Russian FSB troops, and Russia effectively will have a extrajudicial control over certain parts of Armenia. what we also saw recently after the incursion of Azeri troops into Armenia proper in June, when the killing of an Armenian soldier happened and kidnapping of several soldiers, the Armenian government, on the same day as the Armenian soldier was murdered, signed a decree gifting lands to Russian troops in those areas of Sunik where this potential corridor will be laid. So another quite concerning development is that Russia has offered to mediate between Armenia and Azerbaijan to demarcate an Armenian Azeri border. At the same time, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Rudenko stated that effectively this demarcation delimitation will be it is the remaining constraint, for example, for Azerbaijan to integrate with the CSTO, the military bloc led by Russia. It has to be mentioned that no other former Soviet country or countries have done their demarcation at such speed and under duress. So this is quite concerning development, and it will have far-reaching implications both for Armenia's security, its strategic depth, and as well as Artsakh status in the future. So as it stands, Armenia is likely, if nothing continues, Armenia is likely to lose control of parts of Sunik. Even if these communication lines are open, it is unimaginable for Armenians traveling, say, through Nakhichevan to Iran without any military protection, whereas the Sunik corridor will be operated by Russians and they will facilitate link between Azerbaijan and Nakhichevan. There has been also indication by Aliyev that Armenian army must be deprived of offensive weapons. So quite likely the Armenian armed forces will be downsized. In fact, the Armenian government has already spoken about it. Armenia is unable to protect its borders. It's effectively a protectorate, something becoming more and more resembling of Abkhazia rather than an independent state. Now, the 9th of November declaration also came with other agreements. This weren't part of the declaration, but they simultaneously Armenia and Russia agreed on several other things, such as full access of Russian media to Armenian market. There were also Russian Kremlin-linked outlets who put out much more ambitious plans of integration, which includes elevating Russian language to state level, closer cooperation between armies and effective coordination in foreign policy, potential joint combat operations in Syria, and revision of school books and so forth. So this is quite, it just gives you a flavor of how Russia sees this integration. It's a complete absorption of Armenian statehood. Now, some will say, but we talked so much about Turkey. Russia? What about Turkey? Now, Turkey's entry into the region effectively destroyed the Minsk Group international format. But there are two arguments about the Turkish involvement in Karabakh conflict. Some argue that Russia is too weak, and it's now being challenged by Turkey, and Turkey is backed by Western countries, that they see Turkey as a useful tool to contain Russia, and it opens a gateway to Central Asia via Azerbaijan. If this is true, then from Armenian security perspective, it is unclear why Armenia should continue integrating itself with a country that is unable now to deliver on basic security commitments, and it is so weak that despite being a nuclear power state, it is folding at the Turkish threat. Now, the second narrative or scenario which I would support is that there seems to be an implementation of Turkish-Russian regionalization of the conflict. This is a blueprint that worked in Syria And effectively, Russia is happy to deal with the West as long as this West is represented by Turkey. Turkey, in Russian eyes, is becoming an independent player. It is so independent that it's ready to defy the US and NATO. It helps to keep the West in place at bay in some of the regional conflicts. And after all, some Russian members of parliament went as far as saying that they prefer to see Turkish flags in Karabakh rather than French flags. So Turkish entry into South Caucasus, transfer of mercenaries, breaking the international norms by the very NATO member is a great pretext for Russia to advance its own plans in the region. And the regionalization of the conflict means the new division of spheres of influence. And in South Caucasus, currently, it's proposed to be done in this format called 3+3. So 3 stands for Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, and the other 3 are Turkey, Russia, and Iran. So far, Georgia has been resisting. Armenia has tried also to resist, but it's supported by Russia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. Another element of this arrangement is that Turkey has offered its mediation between Georgia and Russia. And if this happens, it will be quite a big coup for Russia. Effectively, this format gives full control or strong control over the region, its infrastructures, any potential routes from Central Asia, any potential pipelines or transport infrastructure from Iran via Armenia to Georgia and further to Europe. Have to say that there is, of course, an element of rivalry in this model, as seen in Syria. So there is a bit of rivalry between Russia and Turkey. However, this competition stops when they have their when it comes to their common objective, which to my mind is to keep the Western players out of the region. So for Turkey, this is a win-win situation. It's for Russia, this is great because they have a new partner. As discussed above, they can cut deals with, and it has no normative issues. So when coming back and just to sum up my presentation here, the Armenian elite is effectively betting on the fallout between Russia and Turkey, or Azerbaijan more precisely. However, there are no contingency plans as to what happens if this fallout doesn't occur. And the evidence shows that, at least when it comes to Russia and Azerbaijan, their relations have been going strong for quite some time now, especially in terms of their integration of elites. And there is no reason to consider that there will be a fallout. So Armenia really doesn't have any other choice but to profoundly restructure its foreign policy and domestic political landscape. Now, the good news is that Ilham Aliyev managed to do something that no Armenian political force could have done. He has finally unveiled and exposed the deep faults both in the foreign policy and domestic policy of Armenia. He exposed the key issues in Armenia's external relationships, and really has left no room for Armenia but to succeed by consolidating its resources around statehood, something that hasn't been done, I'd argue, for almost 3 decades. And with this, I will conclude and hand over to Ara.
Thank you, Lilit. Thank you very much for the quite informative and compelling presentation. There are many questions, but we're going to wait until Armen's presentation to field questions, if that's okay. And Armen, if you're ready.
Sure, yes.
Thank
you. And I thank Lilith for the nuanced presentation of the full texture of challenges that Armenia faces today and has faced on its journey that brought us here. What we're doing today here is a failure analysis. It's an attempt to analyze the catastrophic failure that Armenia experienced during the 44-day war last fall. Now, I wish the Armenian National Assembly had established a commission, a 9/11 type commission that would investigate the failure, identify what went wrong, identify what needs to be done to address the shortcomings, and show the way to build capacity to overcome, mitigate and overcome its consequences. That didn't happen. So the analytical community, those of us who used to be practitioners, and the general public, especially that part of the public that monitors the events and takes interest in events in and around Armenia and Artsakh, are stepping in and giving thought to how to define what went wrong. We can go into a very complex analysis of things we don't even know. There's a lack of information about what happened exactly in the battlefield. There's a lack of information about what was going on with the Armenian diplomatic missions, with the Armenian diplomacy, with the Armenian Defense Department, with the Armenian intelligence, with the Armenian state. But one thing is clear. It was not simply a diplomatic failure. It was not a defense failure. It was not an intelligence failure confined to a single event. It was a catastrophic failure of the Armenian state, of the rationale of the Armenian state, of the rationale of the national security paradigm the Armenian state had built for 30 years, based on the premise of centrality of Russia to address two of its key challenges, the way the Armenian state had defined those challenges, one being deterring Turkey from intervening in the Caucasus, specifically in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and second, deterring Azerbaijan from engaging in a large-scale military offensive to try to change the status quo. In both of these, to build capacity to engage in this, successfully engage in this dual deterrence, Armenia thought that it had to rely on an exclusive relationship with Russia, in fact, monopolize its national security alliance system and build it on the idea that Russia is central to everything. Now, working with Russia comes at a cost. When you work with Russia, you also restrict, you exercise self-restraint in the type of opportunities you have to seek answers to the kind of questions you have, including those to whom an alliance relationship with Russia provides no answers. So Armenia did find itself in that situation. And secondly, any alliance works if it's based on contribution, ownership, and empowerment, and the Armenian-Russian alliance does not appear to have the attributes of any of these. So, but Armenia did build its national security paradigm around Russia. And that alliance, that also includes Armenia's membership in Russia-led international post-Soviet frameworks, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, as well as the Eurasian Economic Union, the so-called Russia-led response to the EU, as well as a number of Armenia-Russia bilateral arrangements, including arrangements with respect to the common defense of Armenia's borders, an integrated air defense capacity, and so on. All of that was supposed to help Armenia address those two challenges: keep Turkey out, keep Azerbaijan down, and both failed. So here's the fundamental question. What did Armenia do wrong? You look at the battlefield, you look at how Armenia lost the war, and the key observation there is that war was lost because Armenia displayed a catastrophic inferiority compared to its adversary, Azerbaijan, in terms of technology. Not just technology, though. It also displayed catastrophic inferiority in terms of everything else that a country needs to have besides technology to make that technology work to perfection. In relationship to the kind of adversary one faces, like Armenia. I don't plan to argue that Azerbaijan conducted an exemplary superpower type military operation. However, it evaporated. it pulverized the Armenian defense because not just it had the drones that it had purchased from Turkey, but it also had a significant superiority in everything that needs to be there for those drones to work. We know that that system of capabilities is generally referred to as C6ISR. It used to be C4ISR, now it's C6ISR. And it stands for Command, Control, Communications, Computers, Cyber Defense, Combat Systems, Intelligence, Surveillance, Reconnaissance. If you don't have those capabilities that animate, that put into motion and give meaning, purpose, direction, effectiveness to the kind of technology you have, then that technology generally is useless compared to the Armenian Sus, SU, the Su Russian-made airplane that had no support and no context and no groundedness in the kind of C6ISR capabilities that the Azerbaijani drones had, the Bayraktars had. They had air support, they had ground support, they had potentially also satellite space-based support, they had command and control support. The Azerbaijani military had engaged in a series of trainings, impressive trainings with Turkey to make sure that it was prepared to act interoperably and in sync with the kind of capacity that Turkey brought into the battlefield. And they succeeded in it. Armenia didn't have any of that, despite the rhetoric that has characterized the Armenian-Russian relationship. That relationship didn't work. Russia simply didn't have the technology to help Armenia withstand the onslaught of Bayraktars. Russia also either did not have or did not want to deploy and wanted to deny Armenia the kind of capacities that would have helped Armenia fight against those Bayraktars with the kind of technology they had. So these two things, deterring Turkey, and in fact, Russia also worked with Azerbaijan throughout the war, continuing to supply it with arms and providing it access to logistics. And Russia worked with Turkey to coordinate and in fact engage in joint action as the war unfolded. So Russia worked with Armenia's apparent adversary and Armenia's archenemy, while also marketing itself as Armenia's only ally. And Armenia has no response to this. Armenia had no option to do anything or did not want to explore any other options. That now puts things in perspective. How did Armenia end up here? Lilith mentioned the series of transactions that occurred in mid-90s and early 2000s that resulted in a significant surrender of Armenia's core competencies, core capabilities, including infrastructural capabilities, manufacturing, to Russia. I would add the Armenian nuclear power plant. I would add the Armenian communication system. Going way back into the mid-90s, when I was in the Armenian government as a mid-level foreign service officer in the political military affairs bureau, I recall it was sometime around early 97 when the Russians put pressure on not just Armenia, but some of the other successor states of the former Soviet Union to surrender the 4-digit semi-secure government communication network to Russia's FSB. I opposed that surrender. The Armenian government decided otherwise, but there were other countries that also opposed it. For instance, I recall that Ukraine vehemently opposed surrendering its former. This is known as the government communication network. It's a 4-digit. It's a 4-digit based government communication network that runs parallel to the general telephone network in the country, and you use those 4 or 2 digits to conduct official government communication without interfering with the general public telephone lines. It's not a classified network, but it's an official use network. And so Armenia surrendered control of that network to Russia already in very early, in mid to late 1990s. There was another attempt by Russia, which succeeded with respect to Armenia, to pressure the countries who had inherited manufacturing capacity that could produce, manufacture Russian-designed arms, weapons. Russia exerted pressure on these countries, including Armenia, to surrender their ability to set independent prices for these products and instead defer the pricing policy to Russia. In other words, they could manufacture AK weapons, AK rifles, but they couldn't set the pricing. They couldn't independently, which means they couldn't independently market, and they couldn't really control the trade in the kind of weapons that they had rightfully inherited, including a share of the design. So these attempts happened. Armenia acted in a very differential way to Russia every time we saw that pressure coming. And gradually Armenia surrendered much of its national capacity to Russia, denying itself, in fact, incremental pieces of its agency. And what it ended up with is having almost no agency when it came to establishing an infrastructural network in a region that it could rely on to build a functioning, profitable economy that would pay for the kind of military plans and social plans and welfare and health policies that any effective government had the responsibility to have. So Armenia did not have an economy. It surrendered its core capacity, core competencies. It in fact caved into Russian pressure to not build core competencies, including the Iran-Armenia gas pipeline with a large enough diameter so that the pipeline could serve regional purposes. In fact, they also surrendered its ownership of that power plant, surrendered the management of the Armenian nuclear power plant, denied itself the numerous opportunities that came its way to build a new nuclear power reactor, including, to my personal knowledge and official knowledge, 2 opportunities from the United States, 2 very serious, tangible opportunities from the United States. My understanding is there's been a 3rd one, which I was not involved in, but I can talk to the other 2. Armenia denied itself the opportunity to work with major Western companies like Cisco that was extremely interested. I recall back in 2001 during the World Bank, IMF, and US government-sponsored Armenian Investment Forum in New York, where Cisco was one of the key presences trying to build a relationship with the Armenian government to help Armenia establish secure communication and networks, and that didn't work. Northrop Grumman attempted to come to Armenia, and the Armenian government denied, rejected, turned down that overture. I was the Armenian DCM when Northrop Grumman approached Armenia, suggesting in tandem with the TDA, Trade and Development Agency, one of the agencies that made up the U.S. Export Finance Credit export financing community, TDA generally providing for feasibility studies. Northrop Grumman wanted to do a feasibility study in Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan with a view to help these countries build civil aviation traffic control systems. To my knowledge, Azerbaijan and Georgia welcomed Northrop Grumman. Armenia turned it down. So there have been, there's a documented record of the Armenian government deliberately denying itself some of those opportunities that any reasonable nation would have jumped at and seized. And it's hard to explain, not just to the audience, but to myself, how could a country that cares about its agency, that understands its challenges, that wants to build capacity to do two critical things for it to survive: A, provide for the safety of Artsakh, and B, provide for its own protection, defense, and economic development, deny itself those opportunities. And the wisdom in a way the Armenian government used to articulate it was, we don't want to offend the Russians. We don't want to do anything that would make the Russians mad. We don't want to do anything that would make the Russians mad and force them to retaliate against us by maybe arming Azerbaijan and encouraging Azerbaijan to attack Armenia and take away Artsakh. Well, guess what? It happened. It happened precisely because Armenia denied itself the key capacity that defines any independent nation, independent agency. So with that agency non-existent, let's see what Azerbaijan did. Azerbaijan moved on to following the establishment of the first ceasefire in the region in 1994, May. Azerbaijan engaged in a strategic effort to develop its oil and gas resources and develop its strategic infrastructure to deliver those resources to foreign markets, to develop alliances and partnerships that would help it, A, gain the financial and economic support to build these systems, and B, gain the diplomatic muscle to, again, create political support, but also mitigate whatever risk would come if they were to engage in these type of activities, essentially building an independent access to the world economy, coming from nowhere, landlocked as Armenia, and really in a much more geographically challenged position than Armenia. I don't think Caspian Sea equals to what one would term sea access for Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan was as landlocked as Armenia was, but they did it. They built a pipeline through Georgia to the Black Sea. They built a pipeline through Moscow, through Russia to Novorossiysk. They built a pipeline through Georgia again to Turkey-Ceyhan, the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, the Baku-Novorossiysk pipeline, and Baku-Supsa pipeline, 3 pipelines. And then they also engaged in developing a similar pipeline infrastructure for the gas resources, the southern corridor that Lilith mentioned, including carving a waiver in the US-Iran sanctions for the part of the southern gas corridor that involves the development of the Shah Deniz pipe, Shah Deniz gas field, that has a 10% Iranian government-owned entity ownership, NIOC ownership. And Azerbaijan achieved this. Just look at the scale and the strategic breadth of the kind of things Azerbaijan did, and compare them to how Armenia acted post 1994 ceasefire. So they worked with Russia, they worked with Georgia, they worked with Turkey, they worked with Iran, they worked with the West, bringing in investment, they worked with the United States, because the United States witnessed in 1998 the Ankara Declaration that brought together Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Turkey, and Uzbekistan in a show of political economic support for the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. in which all of these nations saw a national interest. And Armenia was, of course, absent. So following the setting up of this infrastructure, and Azerbaijan found itself in a position where it began having a profitable economy. Now it could pay for its military modernization, and they did not certainly hesitate to engage in that. They never made a secret out of that. Lilith showed you in slides the evolution of the Azerbaijani military modernization program. What I would add to it is it was not just acquisition. It was joint production the Azerbaijan worked to set up with South Koreans, with South Africa, with Israel. These are the kind of things that Azerbaijan used against Artsakh in a recent war and against Armenia. So it's not just acquisition, it's joint production. It's also training, and we've seen how Azerbaijan never missed an opportunity to engage in joint training with Turkey. Granted, training with Turkey, while Turkey did not act with respect, does not act with respect to Azerbaijan in its capacity as a NATO member. So Turkey's NATO membership does not define why and how Turkey works with Azerbaijan, but it's rather ethnicity and regional interest. But Turkey does carry the experience and expertise and the culture that makes a NATO member so competent in building and helping build defense. So Azerbaijan channeled that experience to Azerbaijan, essentially giving Azerbaijan access to all of that knowledge, experience, technology, while Armenia denied itself all of that. And in the end, Armenia failed. It was no secret that Azerbaijan was engaged in that effort. It was no secret Azerbaijan wanted to resolve the Karabakh conflict militarily. They never made a secret out of it. So I find it hard to understand how the Armenians simply overlooked, ignored, or fried out, simply didn't take seriously any of the things that were not just stated, but also acted on. I recall, in trying to explain this, I recall the mid-90s when Azerbaijan was engaged in this effort to bring together critical political economic support for the construction of the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. And many Armenian analysts, and in fact, seasoned diplomats, especially those of the Soviet vintage, and also many Armenian military figures, again, of Soviet training, used to question the validity of the Azerbaijani claims that there was even oil there, and used to also question the wisdom of what Azerbaijan thought would be a successful mission if they were to try hard to build the critical support and actually do construct that pipeline, do bring that vision to fruition. So everyone used to say, well, they don't have the oil, A. B, the West doesn't have the muscle. They won't dare come into and want to show in Russia's backyard. And C, Russia will never allow a pipeline to be built from Azerbaijan to Europe, bypassing it. Well, guess what? Everything happened. So we come to the basic failure, I think. It's not that Armenia couldn't do anything, but because it was powerless in the face of some mysterious Russia-Azerbaijani alignment that we had no control over. It's simply Armenia surrendered all of its ability and refused to build any, refused to even recognize that if it failed to exercise its agency, if it forfeited it, if it surrendered its agency, others would coalesce and work together. Because it's politics, it's international politics, it's a world of self-help. If you can't help yourself, others won't help you. That same argument, I think, is relevant when one hears complaints about how the West abandoned Armenia. And look, the West is hypocritical. The argument goes, yes, Russia failed to come to our help, but West is hypocritical. Look at what the West did. Look at what the United States did. Look at what the EU did. They didn't go beyond any statements, and the United States even didn't even move a finger to help Armenia. Well, I have to say that if you deny any sort of opportunity to build an equitable relationship with the West, if you invest all of your all of the things that you need to have to build a solid military alliance in Russia, in one single partner, if you turn down opportunities to build that capacity with the West, there's no point in complaining that the West is left with no real instrument to employ to help Armenia. And we can go into a detailed discussion about what sort of challenges would the West face if it were to try to help Armenia. But I think the key here is that Armenia itself failed to even request Western assistance in any meaningful way that when they would go beyond humanitarian assistance. Armenia had opportunities to, in direct communication with very high levels of the US government, for instance, and also with the European Union, with NATO, ask for military help. Armenia failed. Armenia did not ask for military help. So if you don't ask for military help, there's no point in complaining that there was no one to help you militarily. And Armenia keeps, by the way, doing the same mistake, making the same mistake. The Armenians simply inexplicably, unreasonably, persistently deny themselves every opportunity they get to formulate a meaningful request for military help, for help in capacity. And I could go on and explain what I mean when I say that there is a way in which the West could have and still can provide critical capacity to Armenia, critical knowledge to Armenia to build capacity to better defend itself and not rely on perceived Russian help. But Armenia has failed to do it. So again, it comes down to agency, to capacity, to vision, to a meaningful articulation of a regional rationale for Armenia and for Armenia's role with respect to Artsakh. And without articulating that vision and identifying the objectives, without detaching it from what I think is a parasitic reliance on some perceived Russian help, Armenia cannot simply handle the gigantic task that it now faces in a form of a fatal threat to its independence and sovereignty, as we observe Armenia surrendering now the control of its borders to Russia from within, including the border with Iran, including the Zvartnots airport. If any of you haven't noticed yet, when you land in Zvartnots airport, the folks that greet you in those booths are the Russian FSB officers. They're not the Armenian border control. Armenia surrendered its control, the control of its border, even in Zvartnots, to Russians. And that to me is extremely disturbing. Now, if Armenia is to get out of this situation, it needs access to knowledge. It needs access to modern technology. And that knowledge and modern technology is not in Russia. That knowledge and modern technology is in the United States, is in the West. It's way too dangerous for Armenia to continue to rely on the flawed understanding that if it keeps pleasing Russia, it will be able to rescue whatever it wasn't forced to give away as a result of the war. I think quite the contrary, it will have to surrender whatever it still has. And the evidence for that is the Karvajar area that Armenia surrendered even without a single shot. So for Armenia to overcome this seemingly impossible situation, I think it has to make up its mind about the critical need to balance its foreign security policy. And not simply balance it for the sake of balancing, but to identify the kind of capacity it needs to reclaim a critical amount of its agency to be able to address its very urgent physical needs on the border by deploying the right amount of and right capacity in manpower, but also by gaining the ability to support that manpower with the necessary requisite C6 ISR elements and do it independently so that it would be able to stand for itself instead of relying on Russia, because any further reliance will be catastrophically detrimental to Armenia's very national existence as a country. So I'm not going to go into further detail on this. I think I spoke long enough, and with this, I stand ready to take any questions the audience may have.
Thank you. Thank you, Armen, for again, a very informative discussion. Thank you for going back to the 1990s. Thank you for laying out a framework for the origination of some of the problems which have now come full circle and punched us between the eyes.
And by the way, if I may add another thought,
yeah, please do.
And I think it would not do complete justice to our understanding of what went wrong in this war if we didn't take into consideration the global pandemic that had significantly weakened the kind of international response that an Armenian call for action could generate. That's number one. Number two, the Trump administration and the kind of foreign policy that administration was engaged in, that in my view was characterized by strategic withdrawal from some of the areas that turned out to be really detrimental to not just Armenia, but also some of the Armenian communities in the Middle East. And the kind of opportunity it created for Russia-Turkey flirt in the Middle East, specifically in Syria, in Libya, and as we saw in the South Caucasus, particularly in Artsakh, that turned out to be the weaker link, where the Russians and the Turks could come together in pursuit of a joint interest, although in some of the other regions, they competed with each other and in fact fought against each other. So there was a convergence and conflict involving Russian Turkish interests, but in Nagorno-Karabakh, they appear to have coalesced in a way that put Armenia at a very significant disadvantage. I think this needs to be taken into account. I think looking forward, one would have to look at the potential. And I mentioned Armenia reinventing its geopolitical rationale, just like Azerbaijan did with Baku-Ceyhan. I would look at the potential now of a possible Armenia-Georgia regional vision, which would bring Armenia into a context more favorable for a United States, for a more solid United States response compared to how an Armenia-US relationship could evolve had there not been for such a regional context in which Armenia and Georgia could be acting together. Third, I think, is Armenia's ability to project a geopolitical shadow on Nakhichevan. And I don't think Artsakh is lost, but for the moment, the kind of loss Armenia suffered in Artsakh can be compensated if Armenia has the economic and military muscle without intervening in Nakhichevan, project a geopolitical shadow over it. And I think that's possible. It's hard to even wrap arms around that concept, but I think Armenia can do it. Armenia has done it in the past and can do it now. Third, Armenia needs to be very solid and firm about not letting anyone, including Russia, take control over its sovereign territory, whether it's for the purpose of opening a communication corridor for Azerbaijan or for the defense of its own interests disguised under a claim for defense of Armenia's interests. That should never happen. Armenia should never surrender its control of the border with Iran or any square inch of land within its sovereign borders. I think what Armenia needs also to do is to contingent on the potential improvement between the United States and Iran, Armenia needs to factor in that likelihood in its vision. And if that were to happen, prepare for it and shape, in fact, that sort of an eventuality, because the kind of opportunities that would open for Armenia, and I would simply mention one key opportunity, if Armenia is able to also work with the Georgians and with the United States, that would put Armenia at the center of a potential cross-regional strategic communication network that would connect the Black Sea with the Persian Gulf. And if you think of the Black Sea and extend that vision toward to cover Ukraine, you end up talking about the Baltics, Ukraine through the Black Sea, connecting to the Persian Gulf, Dubai in particular, via Armenia and Georgia. That is and I don't know what the probability is for that. This is something from the domain of an intelligence analysis and sometimes a very brave analysis, but I don't rule out that eventually there can be an improvement between the United States and Iran to an extent where the United States could work with Saudi Arabia and Israel and bring together these three key constituents of what could become a very interesting regional dynamic shaped by them, and redirect Turkey toward Ukraine, where this, in this grand vision, an Armenian presence would give Armenia the kind of agency that Azerbaijan didn't even have when they dared build the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline. This would be transformative. And while this is not the only potential outcome that we may witness involving all these countries and regions, and I would also factor in there the potential US interest in working more closely and assuming a stronger commitment with respect to Lebanon, and the potential for removing Hezbollah from that equation. I think there's some very real ideas floating around here. This doesn't come from me, it comes from my observance of the regional political dynamic, the security dynamic, that Armenia has to be very serious about and has to think of scenarios that it would rely on if it were to notice certain materialization of these developments. If this were to happen, Armenia needs to be prepared, and I think that's the best case scenario. There could be other scenarios.
Armen, if I may ask then, to
Sure.
what extent is it critical that Armenia maintain sovereignty exclusive? I think sovereignty already means exclusive, but just to emphasize exclusive sovereignty over the Sunni region if the possibility of a Black Sea, a Persian Gulf corridor transit route were to
I think we would be out of our minds to even think about an outcome or a likelihood where Armenia would not retain sovereignty, an absolute and exclusive sovereignty over any single square inch of its territory. There's just no alternative to that. No reasonable country, no self-respecting nation would ever consider surrendering any part of its sovereign territory to a foreign government, whether it's Russia or Turkey. What difference does it make? What difference did it make during the Karabakh War, the recent Karabakh War? Was it Russia or Turkey? Turkey could have as well been our ally. We would have ended up in the same situation. So no, I think it's absolutely critical that Armenia does not feel alone, does not feel powerless, does not feel defeated. Like for 30 years, Armenia kept under control all of Artsakh.
Yes.
For history, 30 years is nothing. And I think we can still do it. All it takes is faith, competence,
Mhm.
and hard work.
Right. And then with regard to then the article in the armistice agreement or the ceasefire agreement that provides for the corridor through Sunik, what do we think about that then?
Look, the whole concept of a corridor needs to be discredited and rejected, turned down. It was imposed on Armenia under distress. I wish I were one of those negotiators. I would have turned it down. They did not. Part of it was, again, distress. Another part of it was simply that they were misinformed and uninformed about the kind of context in which the communication issues, also those involving Mehri and Razakh, Ijevan Razakh and Gyumri Kars, have generally been discussed within these negotiations. There's
Thank you,
no
Adnan.
corridor to think of. There can be in due course a lifting of the blockades and can be a reciprocal movement of passenger and cargo traffic along that railway or along the road that runs parallel to the railway, and that in conjunction with the opening of the Gyumri Kars railway, of the opening of the Ijevan Kazakh railway up in the northeast of Armenia and respectively northwest of Azerbaijan, and along some of the other measures that can be taken to reclaim the commercial integrity of that space. However, those measures come after the resolution, not before. They cannot precede substantive discussions about the outcome of the Karabakh status, final political outcome in Karabakh. That hasn't happened. In the political agreements I was part of negotiating, those questions came after the signing of the political settlement agreement, not right after the ceasefire declaration. So the way those issues have been framed now are completely out of context, misplaced, and incompetently and a result of an exertion of pressure on Armenia and Armenia's incompetence in accepting
Thank you.
them. They need to be
Thank you, Adnan.
rejected.
Thank you very much. Lily, this is a question for you. And we have many questions, and I'm sorry to all our audience members because clearly we're not going to get to all your questions, but we'll do our best to combine and present. If Armenia were to restructure its foreign policy and geopolitical calculus and strategy, what could be the role of China, of Iran, of the USA, of India? Lilit? And you may want to leave out the corridor discussion because I think Adnan did a phenomenal job bringing that to our attention.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. What I'm observing lately is sort of an extreme in discussions about how to rebuild Armenian security architecture, and it sort of oscillates. It's, you know, if it's not Russia, then let's just find someone like China, you know, or let's just completely focus on Iran. I think the problem is not the partners at this stage. The problem, I see two problems. First, we don't have policymakers, we don't have people who are formulating the purpose or the objectives of the Republic of Armenia. What is it that we want? How do we see ourselves as part of the region, sort of in wider geopolitics? What is it that we're actually pursuing? Do we want to be sort of part of the Eurasian setup, or are we moving away? If we're moving away from Eurasian setup, how do we build this relationship with China? I mean, are we seeing this as exclusive relationships? I would argue that the first thing is the people, and the second is the objectives, and that will clarify to where we're going. My opinion is that things are pretty clear. you have you have a crisis which can be turned around, and Armenia can actually emerge from this quite strong. And for that, you need to have new set of people, both in diaspora and in Armenia, who will be able to outline those objectives. Now, if the first objective will be to rebuild a true capacity, defense capacity, who provides you with the best capabilities, then you go to that country or the set of countries. And to me, I think at the moment, I don't see any engagement from China, but I see great interest from the US and France in particular. And I see that, you can, once you have an agenda, then you're engaged, then you develop an agenda of engagement with India, with Middle East, and ultimately, Russia is not going to go anywhere, but you reset your relationships with Russia. But you have to have a purpose. But if you're guided by fear, by emotions, and by this continual, self-entrapment, then I don't think that you will be useful for any country or any partner. That's impossible to create partnership. Now, the good news is that, as I said, we're actually emerging. Maybe I'm an optimist, but I can see the green shoots. We're emerging from this continuous paralysis of mind, I would say. And once we emerge from that, then we will be able to have this a network of relationships. And I would argue that sort of bilateral agenda, understanding the interest of these players and waving your own agenda into theirs is probably the best way forward. Can I just comment about there's a comment, it says, if you turn down the corridor, you may have lost all of Artsakh. You had no leverage to refuse this. This is from Paul Shahinia. I disagree with that, because this assumes that Russia, as I said, there are two sort of interpretations. This assumes that Russia is an absolutely sort of weak power that has zero control over the region, and that Artsakh was going to be lost had Russia didn't sort of intervene last minute, although people sort of don't explain how come they intervened last minute and what was preventing them from intervening before that. If Artsakh was lost, there is no reason for Russians to be in the region, period. That's it. There are no troops. Yes, perhaps there is an element of Armenia being so weak and having, as Armen was mentioning, incompetent negotiators who only negotiated with Russia only, who didn't refuse. And now we're paying the price for that. But I don't agree with the premise that we're going to lose Artsakh, because this just interprets the whole conflict as a sudden, or maybe not even sudden, Turkish-Azeri aggression, where Russia was sort of, was lost, didn't know how to respond, didn't have capacity. It took 44 days for it to come together and do something about it. Sorry, I just wanted to, I don't know what Armen thinks about it.
Thank you. Lily, may I ask you another question?
Yes, please.
During your presentation, you mentioned that there's a proposal that would deprive Armenia of offensive military equipment.
I was referring to what Azeri president mentioned, not just once, more than once, where he was basically referring to discussions or an understanding that Armenian army, as they call it, as an occupying army, now that it's defeated, it should be deprived from any offensive weapons.
I see.
And that, any sort of attempt of rebuilding offensive capacity will be seen as attempt to of a military comeback down the line. So that's what I was referring to.
Okay, thank you. Armen, may I ask you a question?
Sure.
Given the degree of involvement of Russia, the fact that Russia's actions are driven by single personality, Putin, and the fact that one day Putin will need to pass the baton to a successor, what will the future hold for Armenia if Armenia continues to be effectively a vassal state of the Russian Confederation?
Well, my answer is Armenia should not continue to be a vassal state. Armenia should develop capacity. To develop capacity to assert greater and greater independence, and at one point simply shed the Russian yoke and start running its own affairs itself. Now, building capacity will necessarily trigger Russian pushback, potential retaliation. So while Armenia builds capacity, it also needs to develop risk mitigation strategies and in parallel carry them out as well. So this is not anything that can be accomplished overnight, but we overnight can change our minds, change our hearts, decide that we're going to take back Armenia, we're going to take back and reclaim our agency, we're going to straighten our shoulders and straighten our spine and assert control of our future. There was a question about the 5-year perspective. What would happen after Russia, after the 5 years, when the time comes for the Russian peacekeeping troops to either leave or extend their stay? And this kind of ties into that question again. First of all, there are no Russian peacekeepers there. There's a Russian occupying force in Artsakh. Peacekeepers generally are deployed based on terms of reference, rules of engagement. They're deployed between two warring parties that have established a ceasefire, a temporary peace, and they're there to keep the peace. Here, what you have is Russia having deployed its troops in the territory of Artsakh, generally, mostly where those areas are still under Armenian control, Artsakh control. And also, in my understanding, is in some areas they are no longer under Armenian control, but are formally part of what used to be the pre-war borders of Artsakh. That's not how a peacekeeping mandate, in my understanding, works. That peacekeeping mandate should provide for those troops being deployed in a buffer zone between the conflicting parties. That is not happening here. There is no separation zone between Artsakh and, in other words, the former line of contact no longer works, and the peacekeepers are not deployed along that line of contact. They're in fact deployed all over Artsakh and not on Azerbaijani mainland, Azerbaijani territory proper. So, and the Russians, if they don't leave, then you don't have Artsakh. You have a Russia-controlled Transnistria type entity within Azerbaijan that's not ours. It's not Armenian. Armenia will have no control, my understanding, over it, and whatever access Armenia has to it will deteriorate over time. And Azerbaijanis will take control over whatever means Armenia has, or vehicles or instruments as to still access Artsakh to deploy, let's say, military replacements, military rotation, or some other, or maybe humanitarian assistance. So this will happen if Armenia does not build capacity. So the answer is build capacity, prepare for the eventual withdrawal of the Russian troops, because I think if Armenia is able to develop capacity, if Armenia is able to help Artsakh under these excruciatingly difficult circumstances to continue to develop capacity, if Armenia does not give up the hope that it will one day regain its agency and exercise it the way any self-respecting nation should, Armenia should develop capacity, should prepare for the eventual withdrawal of the Russian troops, and should take pride in it, and should welcome that eventuality, because Artsakh is not Russian. Artsakh is Armenian. And that's what we need to work for. We didn't fight there. Our 5,000 Armenian kids didn't lose their lives for Artsakh to be surrendered to Russia. They fought for Armenia. Their allegiance was not to Russia. So that's my answer. Yes, the Russians should go. They should also go, depart from Armenia when it comes to the 102nd Russian military base in Gyumri. In fact, we're seeing quite the opposite happen. They're expanding their military presence, and I have very serious concern that Armenia simply has, in their minds, the Armenian government has simply decided that it's not going to oppose whatever Russians come up with tomorrow morning. If they want to take over the center of Yerevan, they will allow them to do it. Lilith mentioned a fact that should have caused an outrage, yet it went unnoticed, that the Armenian government, as it keeps losing, as it lost Artsakh, militarily, so to speak, schematically at least, as it keeps losing bits and pieces of sovereign Armenian territory with the Azerbaijani incursions and assertions of authority and control over internationally recognized Armenian possessions, Armenia cedes territory to Russian FSB. That is unheard of. That is unacceptable, and it should have caused outrage. Yet we don't see anything. I understand Armenia. The public in Armenia is not in its best position to even contemplate action against that when they face grief and post-traumatic stress. But what about the Armenian diaspora that largely left that event unnoticed? So ceding land to Turks and ceding land to Russians, to me, is the same. I don't see why Daniel Varuzhan's blood is sweeter than Yeri Shecharentsi's. So I don't know why 1915 can be so traumatic and its memory be so haunting, but 1913 not, or 2020 not, for that matter. Russia helped engineer this war and helped Armenia suffer a devastating defeat, and then came in as a savior when there was nothing else to save, and is trying to reclaim the remainder in a neo-colonialist desire to reassert itself where it can, because it cannot do where it cannot. Look at Ukraine, look at Georgia. In Armenia, they think they can, they're doing it. It's a prestige game, but it's also in many ways a real attempt to restore the USSR. I, as an Armenian, think that we should all be very, very concerned of Armenia's impending loss of independence. I think here we may, in fact, have some common interest with even Azerbaijan and Georgia, because there comes a point where a Russian-Turkish game where they flirt with each other and support each other may no longer be sustainable. But when that moment comes, and Armenia falls first, I am very certain, I think, to a very high probability that Azerbaijan and Georgia will fall as well. We've seen that happen in 1920, and it may happen again. So here's a common interest for anyone who is concerned about any of these three nations or all of them in the South Caucasus. If Russia is left to run its show in the South Caucasus and do it with Turkey, eventually all three Caucasus nations will fail, not just Armenia. So one has to think about a strategy that would respond to that potentially detrimental development for the West and for all of us in that region.
Thank you, Arvin. Thank you very much. Lilith, there's a question asking if you could just elaborate a little bit more about the 3+3 model and specifically Iran's role there.
So as I said, 3+3 means Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, Turkey, Iran. This is very much similar to the Astana process that was applied to Syria. Effectively, it's the countries who have direct interest in the region, would like to have a greater say in terms of the security arrangements, in terms of the deployment of military control over the infrastructure. It's really bringing conflict resolution out of a framework where the Western countries are involved and into a framework where the regional states are involved. That's on the surface. What we're also seeing is that there's a trade-off. So if there are some concessions, say in Artsakh, say the Turks, then there are some sort of gains in Syria and so forth. So it's it's regionalization of conflicts where you take out the international players and you just bring in the regional players, and this is one of the most attractive settings for Turkey, for Iran and Russia. And I'd say that Iran is at the moment sort of in the background, because obviously it's quite interested not to be left out and cannot really be left out. But at the start of the war, I think it was the second or the third day when Iran proposed already the 3+3 model, echoing Russia and Turkey, because it appears that the war didn't come as a surprise to any of these regional players, of course. So that's in a nutshell. Exclude the Western players and to redraw the zones of influence regionally. Iran will be trying to. Iran was always signaling its displeasure with deployment of peacekeepers in Artsakh, but then Iran is quite limited in terms of influencing developments in the region. As we saw during the war, it kept sight and even tried to make some overtures towards Azerbaijan as it saw that the balance was shifting towards Azeris. I don't expect them to be extremely influential because I think Russia and Turkey are in the driving seat. If I may, I can actually answer another question that is sort of linked to this. It says, anonymous, why did Russia choose not to maintain a stronger Armenia as its way countering Turkish-Azeri power in the Caucasus? I'm sorry, but this would presume that Russia sees Turkey and Azerbaijan as adversaries and threat. But I would recommend reading, Russian experts. One of the most outspoken one, Alexander Dugin, a philosopher and sort of the father of the concept of Eurasianism. Eurasianism sees Russia as being, a special civilization where Slavic or Orthodox Russian culture has more commonalities with Islam, and they particularly believe that the Turkish sort of form of Islam is much more acceptable form for the Muslim population of Russia. That if when you frame this question, why is it Russia not interested in stronger Armenia, then one has to answer, why is it that Russia is spending billions of its own capital building Turkey's nuclear power plant that was denied by the West, for example? Why is it that there's so many preferences given to Turkish businesses and so forth? So they are. It's just again, it's Armenian projections on how Russia sees its interest and how they see this the Turkish and Azeri alliance. They don't. I don't see, Russians do not see Azeris as a threat. The Azeris are very well integrated in Russia. Azeri elite, unlike the Armenian elite, is very much aligned and almost embedded in Moscow. They have always been very close relations. And I see this country as a conduit, as a channel to Turkic world. That will open doors for Russians, open businesses for Russians. So why would they, if the price is to have weaker Armenia, so be it. That's how I see it.
Ivan, may I ask a question? This is
Sure.
a little bit different question. What are the chances that Armenia and Azerbaijan can resolve their differences over Artsakh? What would such a post-war Artsakh look like?
I think the fate of Artsakh is resolved in a battlefield. You have the capacity to defend it, you take it, and then negotiate. Armenians had it and failed to negotiate a proper outcome. And I can elaborate on why the Armenians failed to negotiate. Because the Armenians, and now the Azeris, the balance has shifted, the Azeris have it, and they would not, I presume, sit down with the Armenians and negotiate unless the Armenians concede to most of their demands. And I haven't seen a single demand that they have presented recently, and the Armenians have not entertained it seriously. So the balanced diplomatic outcome in Artsakh is derivative of the military outcome. Now, I was part of the Armenian negotiating team on Artsakh from '94. I was in Budapest and negotiated along with my colleagues the Budapest Declaration on Artsakh. I was in Lisbon and witnessed how the OSCE, all 55 nations save Armenia, asserted in a chairman in office statement the primacy of Azerbaijan's territorial integrity over whatever Armenian claims were for the self-determination of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I can, again, elaborate on why I think that happened. In my view, that was a direct reaction in many ways to the way Armenia conducted its presidential election in '96 and its constitutional referendum in '95, where Armenia did not, in fact, meet the expectations of the rest of the OSCE as an emerging democratic island within otherwise turbulent and undemocratic Caucasus. It didn't happen, and Armenia surrendered sort of the privilege of not being pressured too hard about Nagorno-Karabakh's self-determination. We lost that battle in Lisbon, and then I was present at the meeting that involved Primakov, then Russia's foreign minister, Ivanov, Ivanov or Igor Sergeyev, Russia's defense minister, and Russia's chief foreign intelligence chief, and Vazgen Sargsyan and Vartan Oskanyan on the other side. And I was also part of that delegation when the Russians presented to us the common state proposal. And I was reading my cable today that I wrote summarizing the proposal for the minister to arrive in Yerevan from Moscow, get the cable in the airport and go and report to President Kocharyan. This is 1998. And I was struck at how really strategically the situation hasn't changed. The Russians back then told us that if Armenia continues to refuse to make any concessions in the negotiations with respect to Azerbaijan's territorial integrity with the widest possible autonomy for Karabakh, then Azerbaijan may resort to military force, and then that they will develop economically, will be able to pay for their military modernization, will be able to engage mercenaries. Back then, the talk was about Bosnia and Afghanistan. Now we had Syria, and will be able to eventually retake Karabakh by military offensive. And then Armenia will face a catastrophically bad choice. Now, the Russians have always been of the opinion that Artsakh should not be independent and should not be part of Armenia. And there was no illusion. There should have not been any illusion whatsoever within the Armenian negotiating circles and within the Armenian diplomatic and military establishment that there was any potential, any other outcome possible, unless Armenia pulled off a game changer, unless Armenia did something that would have sort of redefined the whole playing field. And in my view, that could have been an artful, diplomatically solid outreach and diversification of the kind of interest and players in the region that would have made it more desirable for Russia to be more, to try to be more aligned to Armenia's objectives rather than to play the role of an honest broker that in this case meant Russia would not support Karabakh's secession from Azerbaijan. So Armenia, and again, this comes back to the Armenian agency. To the extent that Armenia is willing and able to build capacity to eventually exercise greater agency than it does now, I don't see a different outcome in the Karabakh political resolution talks than what we are facing today, which is the worst possible outcome. Aliyev refusing to even recognize any entity in Karabakh. He has resolved, he has disbanded what was the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast. He refuses to recognize any sort of statal entity characteristic for Karabakh, and I think it will be an uphill battle to even convince him that there should be anything like Karabakh. So he's not going to negotiate if Armenia is weak. Armenia needs to get stronger. Again, needs to exercise independent agency to be able to negotiate a better outcome. But it can start doing it now, and all it needs to do is to, again, it comes back to needs assessment, to what does it take, what went wrong, what does it take to make it right, and how long will it take, and how much. That's really what Armenia needs to be concerned right now. Soberly looking at where it is, and piece by piece addressing how do we fix this, identifying the key major core things we need to have in place so that we could build on it and get better.
Arben, with regard to fixing this, and in light of the elections, and Lilith, this question is to you also. Who do you see, where do you see opportunities, groups, whether it's the ruling party, the parliamentary, opposition parties outside the parliament that do not meet the threshold to become part of the parliament? Where in that landscape do you see some groups and individuals that are willing to take or that are considering taking a more broad approach with regard to Armenia's partners?
Well, I think one of the positive outcomes since the ceasefire has been to the reshaping of Armenian both domestic political landscape, but also changes in diaspora. There was one question about, part of our failure is because we failed to engage diaspora fully. And I totally agree with that. Part of our failures is because of the type of political elite that we have. I don't even want to use elite because it doesn't even qualify as an elite, but the sort of decision makers that we have in Armenia happen to have a lot of money. This is oligarchy. It is still an oligarchy. And that has been one of our weaknesses, where there has been no room for meritocracy. And the easiest decision has been to delegate Armenia's security matters to another country. Whether it's friendly or not, it's another question. Whether it's reliable or not, that's another question. But that has been the strategy. equally, those diaspora has failed to challenge this approach and went along. Now, what we're seeing in Armenia is sort of self-organization, emergence of groups, and those are offering sort of alternative to the narrative that has been in Armenia for such a long time. We've seen, the public media, television giving floor to parties like the NDA and parties like the European Party and Andres Vukassian's party, and all these guys who are explaining their own vision, how there is, that it's not an impasse, that it's possible to get out. Of course, this requires a lot of back and forth, a lot of challenging, a lot of refining as to how it's done. Out of all these discussions will come forward people who will look more sort of down-to-earth way of saying, okay, as Armin was saying, what are our needs? How do we meet these needs? What is our 12-month purpose? What are we doing in the next 3 years? And I think this parliament does not reflect what Armenian voters want. This parliament was created out of spite. Those who voted for Kocharyan did it out of spite of Nikol Pashinyan and vice versa. Of course, they had their core supporters, but really the victors in these elections were Kocharyan, Nikol Pashinyan, but Armenian people lost. So I'm hoping that this parliament will be short-lived, and it will give time for the parties that will have a new agenda, that is not just about sort of the hopelessness, but will present a clearer path that is okay to engage with other players in the world. And as I mentioned, these parties, the Democratic Axis, the European Parliament, the European Party, and so forth, they have failed to come together, but hopefully a bigger platform will be formed for these alternative forces in the future.
Thank you. And what are your thoughts with regard to the diaspora part possibly playing a role in the broadening of discussion and the broadening of policy formation and
well, I think
capacity building, I guess.
I think the diaspora
and not within a specific direction necessarily, because there seems to be one of the consequences of this war is that we've seen now that the state building trajectory, the state building exercise was very weak, and so therefore we need institutional capacity to be built, and regardless of the policy that comes out of it, frankly, right? So not necessarily. So in that regard, in that context, do you see opportunities?
I think diaspora has been understandably pretty preoccupied with the genocide issue. For many in diaspora, survival, the identity, the well-being of their communities has been more important rather than Armenia. Armenia came as a, in some ways, as a home that needs help. So it was about sort of humanitarian assistance, facilitating humanitarian assistance, but ultimately diaspora should not be guiding Armenia. Armenia should be guiding diaspora. Armenia should have should be the state that has its objectives, and the diaspora can be in that supportive role. And Armenia should be also sort of guiding the diaspora political organizations on the messages of the day, which can shift. Because, the diaspora has its own fears, its phobias, its preferences. Most of the diaspora comes from Middle East with its own preconceptions about the world, which change. So their guiding principle preferably should be what Armenian state interests are. Again, it requires a lot of close cooperation and management of the political leadership.
Thank you, Lilit. Armen, that's our final question. Is there something that you would like to add to that as well?
I'd like to contextualize a little bit the question and response. Well, specific to the United States, I don't think Armenia can guide what the diaspora should do. Armenia does what Armenia does, the diaspora does what diaspora wants to do, and the way diaspora understands what is it that it has in common in what Armenia does. The diaspora should articulate and advance its own agenda based on what it thinks affects its interests or is of interest to it. So in that sense, I have been witnessing a strange humanitarianization of the diaspora's pro-Armenia agenda. And I think that's, to me, that's concerning, because what the diaspora does is not necessarily where I think diaspora could do more to help Armenia overcome the stress, the post-traumatic stress of the war, and reclaim itself and build capacity. If that's what diaspora thinks, it can articulate as its own interest. Certainly, this cannot be dictated from Armenia. Again, what we're dealing here is not lobbying, it's advocacy that expresses the desires and interests of the Armenian American community.
Thank
However,
you, but go ahead. I'm gonna interrupt you only because I kind of lied. I said there was no more questions. This will be our last question. But there's a question that just came up that I think I'd like you to respond to, because there's always been an observation that Azerbaijan has not been willing to make any concessions, right? And therefore, they created the situation, they perpetuated the situation until they were able to solve it militarily. In your work, in your time, when you were negotiating, and also your knowledge of what has followed, I mean, what were some of the significant concessions that you thought that Azerbaijan was willing to make?
I thought more or less one area in which, if we were to sort of go back to 1997, or I'd say rather pre-Lisbon, 1996, where we had two texts under negotiation, the package and step-by-step, having the security of Artsakh at its core, the package having the status of Artsakh at its core. Two different approaches. We used to negotiate on both texts in parallel at the same time. Like, we had two texts, I have both of them in front of me. We would negotiate over one in the morning and over the other in the afternoon. But again, the package proposal was based on a premise that once you agree on the status, everything else is agreeable. This was the approach favored by the Karabakh delegation, by the Artsakh delegation, not so much by the Armenian delegation, but the Armenian delegation generally coordinated its positions with Artsakh and gave Artsakh deference when it came to interpreting what was best for Artsakh. So we used to go along. And then there was the step-by-step approach, which I intellectually favored more, that was centered on the premise of the primacy of security. And the understanding was, if you have the security of Artsakh, if you control security, you control pretty much everything else. I favor it because I think that security comes first, because military capacity, security comes first. Now, the Azeris happen to be favoring the step-by-step as well. The reasoning for them was different. Step-by-step had a built-in time perspective in it. In other words, Artsakh would fall under the control of that party which were able to emerge from whatever that time perspective was for the step-by-step implementation as economically more competitive. So the key variable was economic competitiveness. If you were to go for the step-by-step approach, you would arrive at a kind of status in the end that you wanted if you emerged economically more competitive. Armenia wasn't sure it could sustain that economic competition over the long run. That was, I think, Armenia's predicament which I think that Petrosian, I wish he could have presented it better in his famous Larjana Lupaha article. He did not. I think he presented it as a choice between the bad and the worse. I would have presented it differently. I would have suggested to the public a different vision. I would have said, look, it all is now dependent on how competitive Armenia will be toward the conclusion of this process. Shall we be able to have a profitable economy to pay for our programs? Shall we be able to continue to afford to pay for our troops? Or we will fail. If we do, and Azerbaijan emerges as more competitive, they have the final outcome in their hands. So that was the thing. And the Azeris understood the dynamic. So rather than negotiating with us over the details, which we did, by the way, we were able to agree many things, including a general understanding that Lachin would be under Armenian control, and that the Lachin corridor would not be 5 kilometers wide the way it is now, and certainly it's not under Armenian control, but it would be probably some 25 kilometers wide, and that there would be no withdrawal from Lachin, from that corridor, and that Armenia would preserve its ability to intervene militarily if anything were to go wrong with the phase-by-phase implementation of the ceasefire agreement. In addition, the ceasefire agreement, which in large part has been published, but what hasn't been published are the implementation annexes of the ceasefire agreement, the step-by-step agreement where we were negotiating. The military technical annexes really contain much of the heft of why step-by-step was feasible, and why we could have worked out a deal with the Azeris. Probably not could have worked out everything concerning the status, but if you put the status ahead, you simply can't unless you force someone to capitulate. So the military technical annexes provided for a set of measures that would have provided for the irreversibility of the peace process. It did contain a withdrawal schedule, but the schedule was designed in a way that gave no advantage to either of the potentially withdrawing parties. For instance, the Armenians were supposed to start withdrawing from Aghdam, let's say, X number of days past the date of the signature of the agreement. But then the next withdrawal would be due for Azerbaijan to vacate the areas in Mardakert and Marduni that they were keeping under their control. And if they didn't do that, then the Armenians would not have started withdrawing from other territories that the Azerbaijanis claimed as theirs. And I'm talking about territories outside Nagorno-Karabakh proper.
And this is what was proposed, and to
This
what extent agreed upon? To what extent agreed?
This is what was being negotiated. Some of that had been agreed. Some of that had not been agreed. There was a rule within the Minsk group: nothing is agreed before everything is agreed. We had working level arrangements, working level measures to identify what we had been able to agree on. Like we would make them bold in the text, but there was an understanding that this was not for public consumption, and I prefer to keep it that way. But generally speaking, there was a deliberate, well thought, and balanced design for these withdrawals. For post-withdrawal activity, such as the Azeri armed forces had to withdraw from the line of contact to a larger depth than the Armenian formations in Karabakh. Like if they were to withdraw for 25 kilometers, it didn't mean the Armenians had to withdraw for 25 kilometers, because that would have left nothing from Karabakh. The Armenians would be potentially, let's say, withdrawing, for example, for 5 kilometers deeper. Then there were arrangements for the separate deployment of the troops, the ammunition, the spare parts, and the weapons themselves, in a way that would not give an advantage. That would give an advantage to the defending party if the other party were to launch a sudden military offensive. They couldn't do it within a time frame within which the defending party could have assembled a defensive capacity and could have stopped the aggression. So that was also planned. the peacekeeping force, there was a deliberate document, like 500-page document under the OSCE, put together by a multinational peacekeeping working group led by a Finnish colonel, Colonel Heikki Vilen, that spelled out the rules of engagement, terms of reference, modalities of deployment. It comes nowhere close to, in fact, the present Russian peacekeeping activity in the region comes nowhere close to how well designed the multinational peacekeeping force was. And this is something that I think Armenia could have insisted on having deployed instead of conceding the Russian pressure, letting the Russians come and push the OSCE peacekeepers out. So key elements was there was an appreciation in Azerbaijan of the strategic depth that some of the areas surrounding NK proper represented for Armenia and Artsakh. And I'm talking about Lachin, to some extent Kubatli, to some extent Kelbajar, although there was no agreement on either Kubatli or Kelbajar. However, there was an appreciation of the difference that these areas represented for both Armenia and Artsakh compared to, let's say, Aghdam. Then there was an appreciation of the need to have a streamlined border that would be defendable and also passable, usable, functionally meaningful. Let's say if you look at the Martakert-Martuni road, it transits through Azeri, through the Aghdam region. There, I think, was a window and an understanding that those things needed to be negotiated so that we could keep the cohesiveness, the cohesion of the regional transportation networks, their integrity, and not to compromise them by unnecessarily or necessarily withdrawing from those areas the way the Azeris wanted us to withdraw. Then there was the concept of Armenia's right to intervene militarily if anything were to go wrong with the implementation. So these three elements, plus Shushi. Shushi was never part of the withdrawals. Shushi was viewed within the context of negotiations as a refugees issue. Any Armenians, and we were negotiating with respect to Shushi on the basis of whatever reciprocal arrangements we could negotiate with Azerbaijan with respect to Shahumyan. Let's say if Shushi were to be seen as a place where Azeri refugees or displaced persons could return, so would be Shahumyan. But there was certainly no question about Shushi being viewed in any other status than a city within the Nagorno-Karabakh, the way we would talk about Nagorno-Karabakh as a state of entity in the context of negotiations. So these were things that I don't think faced any major disagreements from Azerbaijan or from the mediators. But obviously,
1997 changed this.
What changed?
The Lisbon summit, you're saying?
No, I think the recent war changed it. I think all these ideas were under discussion up until when it turned out that Armenia has no means, no way to defend Karabakh, and Azerbaijan can just come and take it. So the whole rationale for Azerbaijan negotiating for Armenia disappeared, because you have Karabakh, you can keep it. That's what the dynamic dictates. That's what any conflict dynamic, you can keep it. If you can keep it, you keep it. A republic, if you can keep it. That's the wisdom. So we failed to keep it. The challenge is, how do we go back? Can we go back? And how do we, A, prevent further concessions that will be, they are threatening Armenia proper, and then once we prevent that, how do we go back and try to reclaim as much of the Artsakh agency as we can?
Thank you, Adnan. Lily, do you have a final?
I'm just looking through the questions.
Otherwise, wrap it up. Yeah.
Yes, looking through the questions, lots of good questions, but I would sort of quickly run through them and just one-liners.
Okay, one line. Okay.
I think people made a good effort. There's a question about whether Levon Petrosyan was right that Armenia was too weak, you know.
It's 2:30 in the morning for you, so if you're willing to run through it quickly, then
yes. So I would say that it wasn't really Artsakh that was the reason why we became weak. It was poor policies. So I don't think we should blame Artsakh. Otherwise, we can then blame Sunik and, you know, we're basically weak to take care of ourselves. So that's not really an approach. That's not a realistic approach. There's one about not being Russified, but why is this? Why blame Russia for Armenia's failure? It's I personally didn't try to blame anyone. I tried to explain how that not always Armenia's interests coincide with Russian interests, but it's a fact that you have chosen an ally and the ally didn't deliver on a number of things. So, you know, there's a question what to do, concrete steps, next steps. To be honest, I don't think we can talk about concrete steps until there is a clear consensus as to what has happened, where we failed, who failed us or not failed us, and then what we want next. Unless there is a consensus on this, I don't think we will take steps forward. But I know there was a comment about why are we optimistic, because we have been in difficult positions, and there is, I mean, not being optimistic is not an option. What's there? Yes, we can continue sinking. That is basically the baseline scenario now. But at some point, there has to be a rebound. I don't know about, there's also a question about when Armenia can regain strength and go back to negotiations. I think it will take years at current pace, and given the political sort of leadership now and the opposition in the parliament, these are spent forces to me. We need a gradual sort of change, or maybe even faster change of policymakers in Armenia that will come up with a more, you know, realistic answers to Armenia's pressing questions. As I said, the baseline is that we're basically sinking. So how to pull back and start you know, from zero, but restructure ourselves, that is something that people see the need. So when you identify the objective, eventually you start working towards it. I know that there are separate smaller groups that are already working on the concepts of implementation. They can be very technical. They can be, as Armin was saying, you know, capacity building here and there, and ultimately these teams and groups come together. I think there was one question about why didn't we declare ourselves as inheritors of the first republic? Wouldn't that solve our problems with Azerbaijan? I'm not an expert on that, but I'm not sure if it probably would have framed the argument differently, legal argument. But I would, if Armin has an answer.
I'll say just Saman Kajat Zenkirans. That's the wisdom. Defend yourself and then negotiate on your terms. If you can't defend yourself, no one will.
And just one question, one bit about diaspora and Armenia. There was a question about what would happen if Armenia tries to sort of rebuild itself, gain new capacity, but Russians are against it because they would prefer the current setup because it fits their purpose at the moment. The good news is that Armenia has majority of Armenians do not live in Armenia, and they do have political organizations that can pursue a different agenda. They don't necessarily have to sort of accept that, for example, the corridor should be granted and all the other concessions or the limitation. So there is an area where the diaspora organization can come up with their influences over their respective governments, to made aware of the dangers both to Armenia and to regional security and to wider Western interests. Yeah.
If I may very briefly just comment on what Lilith said, what the Armenian American community can do, say, advocate for Armenia's energy security, advocate for Armenia's US help in helping Armenia rebuild its infrastructure, help US help in helping Armenia reinvent a national defense capacity, potentially an air defense capacity, and defend its borders. Technical assistance, military assistance, not simply fighting over what the US does for Azerbaijan and completely avoiding the issue of what the US can do for Armenia. We need, I think it would be well reasoned to formulate an agenda that supports and encourages US assistance to help Armenia build core capacity. Again, energy, space resources, self-defense, homeland defense, and governance, and general infrastructure, integrity of the Armenian infrastructure, and regionalization of that infrastructure. Potentially Armenia-Georgia projects could be very helpful. I think another thing would be help Armenia establish a meaningful relationship with Israel and establish a direct communication with Turkey. And this is not to say Armenia should reconcile with Turkey. There's nothing to reconcile over. Armenia should simply not let other countries, including Moscow, monopolize the discussion with Turkey concerning Armenia's fate. It should be able to run that discussion independently, directly, potentially with Western help. So these are the kind of things I wish we as the Armenian American community could come together and formulate and articulate and then pursue. And maybe communities in other countries, particularly the UK, would also be able to mobilize and come up with an agenda of their own that would be relevant to what the United Kingdom can help do to help Armenia rebuild itself and reclaim itself. That's my concluding remark.
Thank you, Armen. Thank you, Lilith. Really, thank you, Lilith. I mean, I think we also hijacked your morning and your day tomorrow.
That's okay. I think they've been really amazing questions, but yes. I want, because I'm so sorry just to bring this one in, because I think it's so painful for people. And there's one question that I wanted to answer the first, and I will finish with that. The question about, if we knew that this is going to be such a devastating war, why didn't we agree? Why didn't we just agree to all the terms and avoid this humanitarian loss and territorial losses? First of all, well, this speculation, but my reading is that the Armenian side knew that there will be some concessions, but it will be probably limited, maybe 3 regions, maybe 4. But it appears that the negotiations between Russia and Azerbaijan had changed, because there were indications already in 2019 that Shushi was included in sort of the terms that the Azeri side would propose to Russian. So I think that was miscalculation perhaps on the Armenian side as to the extent of the strength of the attack, the red lines for Russia. Maybe there was we don't know, but certainly there has been communication between Yerevan and Moscow. And ultimately, there was also, of course, the whole rift, it appears, within the political and military leadership. And finally, you know, the belief that these are the Armenian lands, and it would have been but difficult to see how people will agree to simply giving up territories, especially when there was no clear prospect of prospect of ensuring the independence of Artsakh. So various problems that culminated in what we have now, both Armenian issues and also the external dealings that we don't know. They are telltale signs. If you follow the Russian media, sort of they surface quite a lot. So
there's
that's
also strategic corruption with respect to Russia and Azerbaijan. There's very serious evidence.
Well, I mean, we talk about diaspora, but we have huge diaspora in Russia, and it's a country that they understand well. They understand how the decision making is done. It's not, you cannot apply the same template that you apply in Western countries and into Russia. They should have known better, and they should know. And if you want to engage, there was a question whether it's possible to turn Russia into a good ally. Well, we have nearly 2 million Armenians there, and I'm pretty sure they know how it works, and nothing impossible, but it's about identifying what is it that you want and how you want to achieve it. And again, consensus as to what went wrong, what are the weaknesses, and what we want to achieve.
Lily, I think that's a great place to end.
Thank you, Ara. Thank you,
Thank you very
and
much.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you.
Us from across the United States and, in fact, around the world. Thank you all. Thanks. Take good care.
Still reading the comments.
Yes, we are. We are. And for all those in the United States, we wish you a safe and joyful 4th of July.
Ara, would these comments be saved somewhere for us to access them?
Yes, we will. And for all those who did not see in the chat, the talk has been recorded and is on YouTube at St. Leon Events. If you do a search on YouTube, you'll be able to find the recording of today's discussion. And for those who wanted to speak, but this format, we decided not to allow other speakers from the audience. Perhaps in the future it could be different, but this time this is how we decided to move forward. Thank you. And I think we will try to create another opportunity because there is a lot that needs to be covered. Thank you all.
Thank you. Good night.
Night. Good night.